Well, during this past summer, I visited a friend of mine from the seminary. We haven't seen each other in a number of years. And he was telling me a story about his first pastor, who was an elderly and sort of gruff fellow. And he said this man would often put parishioners on the spot. And he said the pastor finished Mass one morning by saying, "Next Sunday, I'm going to preach on the subject of lying." And he said, "So as a preparation for my sermon, I'd like you to read Mark chapter 17. Well, on the following Sunday, the pastor began his homily, and he said, as he was looking out at the congregation, he said, "Last week, I asked you to read Mark chapter 17. If you read the chapter, please raise your hand." And nearly everybody in the congregation raised their hands. And with a little bit of glee in his voice, he said, "You are the very people I want to talk to," he said. There's only 16 chapters in Mark. I promise not to do that to you today. But as we come to this time of reconciliation, I wonder, what is the difference for us between anger and disappointment? When we're looking for forgiveness, that difference is enormous. So when somebody is angry at us, it's not easy to approach them. In fact, it may even produce some fear in us, like the linebackers that Sister Sally was just talking about. We say things like, "I'm afraid to talk to her. I don't even want to go near her. She's so upset." That's anger. On the other hand, when someone is disappointed in us, at least for me, it brings me to a different place. I begin to reassess my actions. I begin to think about wanting to be reconciled. And I want to do better because I don't want to let that person down. I don't want them to be disappointed. That difference between anger and disappointment is what makes the image of God from the writings of the prophet Hosea, which we just heard, so unique and so appealing. Now, I am not a scripture scholar of the Hebrew Testament, but what I do know about the prophet Hosea is that the prophet lived in a very tough time in salvation history. He lived near the end of the kingdom of Israel, and he was witnessing a lot of bad things in his time. We might call it in our day self-destructive behavior. There was mistreatment of poor people, there were factions in leadership, there were assassinations, people were worshiping all kinds of different gods. And worst of all, at least for Hosea, there was an ingratitude for what God had done for the people. Now, like most prophets, Hosea has a message of condemnation for unfaithfulness, and we hear that from a lot of other prophets. But with Hosea, there's another part. There's a promise of consolation in the future. What most people find refreshing about Hosea is that when condemning the sins of the nation, the tone is not harsh. So in Hosea, rather than an angry God that punishes, there's a sad God that we see, watching people destroy themselves. It's the difference between anger and disappointment in living color. Now, I would bet that each one of us has been in God's position at some point in our life. I mean, the position that God comes from in this reading we just heard. Watching people we love destroy themselves. Some of you have talked to me about your children, and I've often heard of the struggles that people have watching their children self-destruct on drugs or other devices. We have family members who are addicted to alcohol. We know our loved ones who are eating themselves out of control. People making poor choices in their marriages or employment. And how about when we have to watch someone who is exceedingly talented and they're just wasting their time and wasting their life? But with all of these, the God of Hosea's writings is slow to anger and slower to punish. The words we hear today are these. Father Terry just read them. God says, I will not give vent to my blazing anger. In other words, put it in our day, I'm not going to have a meltdown on you. God may be angry, but God's not going to have a meltdown. For I am God and not human. God doesn't act like we would react.